Yeah, welcome to my presentation on summary functions of univariate patterns. So in a univariate pattern we have only one type of point and there is no mark. This here is one typical example of a univariate pattern. So you see only black points of only one type. Yeah, and these points can have many different meanings. So for example, they could be the trees of one species in a forest, they could be the home range of individuals, they could be the ignition points of wildfires, or even they could be the locations of various circles in Namibia. Or, as in our specific case, they are the locations of droppings of seed-dispersing animals. Yeah, of course there are several very typical questions one asks for this type of pattern. So for example, does the pattern show a random spatial structure? In the example here it's already very clear that this is not a random pattern because the points are aggregated. But in other cases they also may show regularity, and this is now an example of a very nice regular pattern, and you see immediately the differences. But in general, we are not really satisfied to know if the points are aggregated or show regularity. We want to extract more information from the pattern because we have all the full spatial information. So for example, we can ask, at what scales is the pattern aggregated? What is the scale of regularity of the pattern? And to answer this type of questions, we need something that is called summary function. So what are summary functions? Simply said, they summarize the statistical properties of point patterns. So they capture the different aspects of the potentially very complex spatial structure, and usually we may need several summary functions to characterize complex patterns. Yeah, in our case of this pattern here, how we can quantify its statistical properties. Yeah, to characterize the properties of point patterns, we must usually make one very important assumption. And this is the assumption of homogeneous patterns. In a homogeneous pattern, the same spatial configuration is repeated stochastically all over in the observation window. And there is no spatial variation in the point density. So if you look at this pattern, you see that the point density all over is more or less the same, and this typical spatial small-scale structures repeat the whole time. So there's no difference in the spatial structures at different locations of the plot. So this is a homogeneous pattern. In other words, a homogeneous pattern means that there is no influence of the environment on the locations of the points. On the first view, this may seem as a quite unrealistic assumption, but there are also more advanced techniques that can relax this assumption. But by excluding the effect of the environment, this allows us to concentrate on the interactions among points. Yeah, anyway, if we have a homogeneous pattern, it makes sense to define something called a typical point. And this is now here the typical point of the pattern. And then we try to characterize the pattern by looking at the properties of the neighborhood of the typical point. In practice, however, this will be the average point, and we estimate the neighborhood properties for each point and then average over all points in the pattern. Yeah, many summary functions are based on the idea of the typical point. So for example, Ripley's K-function, this is probably the best known summary function in point pattern analysis. This is simply the number of points within distance r of the typical point. Or the percolation function, which is in my view the most important summary function. This is the density of points a distance r away of the typical point. So in this case we have a small ring around the typical point. And then to estimate the percolation function, one counts the number of points in the ring around the typical point and then divides by the area of the ring. That means one estimates basically a neighborhood density function. Finally, the nearest neighbor function is the probability that the nearest neighbor of the typical point is located within distance r. Yeah, now I want to define the percolation function and present you some of its important properties. Yeah, the percolation function g is the expected density of points in rings with a radius r and a certain width around the typical point of the pattern. And in this case, lambda is the intensity of the pattern, which is the number of points in the whole observation window divided by the area of the observation window. Yeah, for example, this is now one univariate pattern. This in the left corner is the typical point and its ring. And then we can define the so-called neighborhood density or O-ring statistic. And this is the number of points in the ring around the typical point divided by its area. This O-ring statistic has a very nice interpretation of being a neighborhood density function, but it depends on the overall intensity of the points in the observation window, which we call the lambda. So this is a somewhat not very nice properties. Therefore, it is usually normalized by lambda, and the normalized summary function then is the percolation function. And this percolation function now has a number of very nice properties and interpretations. So the percolation function has a value of 1 for completely random patterns. And this is because in this case the neighborhood density is the same as the overall density of points in the observation window. This also means that the percolation function uses the density of a random pattern as the point of reference. It tells us how many times larger or smaller the neighborhood density is compared to the data of a random pattern. Yeah, and in a situation where we have aggregation, then the percolation function is larger than 1. And if we have regularity, the percolation function is smaller than 1. Yeah, here now I want to show you one example how the percolation function looks for an aggregated pattern. So again, now we have here our example aggregated pattern. Again, we have the typical point and the ring around the typical point. And this is now the percolation function. Note that we now have on the x-axis the spatial scale or the radius of the ring around the typical point, and at the y-axis we have the relative neighborhood density. So for example, we can now look at a distance of 5 meters, and at this distance we find that the neighborhood density is about 8 times larger than expected by a random pattern. And this is something we call aggregation. Yeah, now we want to look at the nearest neighbor distribution function d. This function is the proportion of points that have their nearest neighbor within a certain distance r. Now again, this is our aggregated pattern. This is our typical point, and you may notice that you see that the circle around the typical point just touches the nearest neighbor. Yeah, this is how the nearest neighbor distribution function looks like. Again, if we look at a distance of 10 meters, we find that about 80% of all points have their nearest neighbor within 10 meters. Yeah, you may have noticed that the nearest neighbor distribution function is not normalized relative to a random pattern, as this was the case for the percolation function. That means by just looking at the value of the function, we cannot get information about aggregation or regularity. Therefore, I also plotted for you a gray line that shows the nearest neighbor distribution function for the corresponding random pattern. So just look here to the gray line. Yeah, if we use this information, we see that about 50% of all random points have the nearest neighbor within 10 meters. And of course, this is expected for a random pattern. Yeah, to close this section, I will briefly introduce a summary function of a quite different nature. As you remember, the percolation function and the nearest neighbor distribution function characterize properties of a typical point of the pattern. They are point-centered summary functions. However, we can also characterize a pattern from the perspective of a random test point. This is exactly the idea of the empty space function. It is the proportion of points that have their nearest neighbor within a certain distance r of a randomly placed test point. This summary function is also more technically called spherical contact distribution. Again, this is our aggregated pattern. And now you see the green dot on the left corner. This is now our randomly placed test point, which does not coincide with any point of the pattern. And you see that now the circle just touches the nearest neighbor of the pattern. In a way, the empty space function describes the gaps in the patterns. So here you see a few of the larger gaps in the patterns. In praxis, the empty space function can be estimated by locating test points at a very fine grid and determine for each grid point the distance to the nearest point. And this is now how the summary function looks like. Again, we can look at a distance of 10 meters and we find that only about 20% of all test points have the nearest neighbor within 10 meters. Again, I plotted also a gray line that shows the empty space function for the corresponding random pattern. We see that about 50% of all random points have their nearest neighbor within 10 meters. The aggregated pattern has therefore larger gaps than the corresponding random pattern because the points are placed more close to each other. Yeah, after having presented the most important summary functions for the univariate point patterns, we will make a short break and go on in the next video with null models and simulation tests. See you then.